It's Inferno by Max Hastings. He's a British military author, and he's written some wonderful books. Second World War here, and he's written a First World War book as well. John Keegan, I don't know whether you've seen his Second World War book, which was fantastic. And I used Winston Churchill's Volume 2, Their Finest Hour, out of his 6-volume set of discuss. On the 30th of August, 1939, Adolf Hitler, the German Fuhrer, gave his military commanders orders to start the Second World War. At the time, he had 3 million troops, 400,000 horses, 200,000 vehicles, 14,000 aircraft, 5,000 trains, ready to advance on the Polish frontier. The attack began the following morning, on the 1st of September, 1939. 2 days later, France and Britain both declared war on Germany, fulfilling their guarantees to the Polish nation that they would, their security guarantees to the Polish nation. 9 months later, on the 10th of May 1940, Winston Churchill became the Prime Minister, replacing Neville Chamberlain, which was an interesting period of time. Just we could have a talk on that. But it was a very eventful month, May 1940 was, because the events that we're going to talk about tonight, the evacuation, the deliverance, if you will, of Dunkirk, happened during his first 3 weeks in office. To give a day-to-day, battle-to-battle summary of what happened during those early months of the Second World War would be much too long. I'm concentrating primarily on the Dunkirk. So we're going to discuss what happened basically during the month of May 1940. Used their blitzkrieg tactic to defeat Belgium and Holland, and they had already taken Paris. After heavy fighting in the north of France, the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, and I'll use that initial during part of this, they, along with the French, were forced to begin falling back toward the English Channel at Dunkirk. To set the stage, let's talk about how the Allied forces got themselves into this position east the English Channel. North of them, the French and British armies were retreating northwest toward Dunkirk. They would be trapped on 3 sides by the Germans, and they'd have the sea at their back. On the 24th of May, Adolf Hitler and his senior commander of the German forces in the west, General Rundstedt, met to discuss the fate of the retreating British and French armies. At this meeting, they decided not to move forward against the British and French, allegedly because Rundstedt wanted to preserve his tank force for what he considered to be a greater need. That was the destruction of the large French forces in the south. If he could, quote, bomb the British troops to hell from the air. Hitler and Rundstedt probably were right in holding off because their Panthers, their tank force, might have found it very difficult because of the soft turf around the canals and rivers at Dunkirk. And so Hitler's stop order lasted for 2 full days when they had an opportunity to move in, and until the afternoon of 26 May. These 2 days in retrospect were probably very decisive regarding the outcome of the war. The Germans had 7 armored divisions against this large French and British army. However, they had no supporting infantry behind them. They were moving so quickly, their Panzer Force. The risk appeared to be tremendous because they were exposing their flank, which was nearly 300 kilometers long. The 3 German commanders decided to press on because they were confident that the shock and awe of this action would allow them to beat the French and the British. The Germans to race west to cut off a large faction of the French and the entire British army as they retreated toward the coast. The Germans were in a position to completely annihilate and or capture the Allied forces who had stopped with them. It's estimated that the Germans could easily move in and capture all these Allied troops, but for the fact that Hitler intervened and ordered his troops to halt their advance prior to their reaching Dunkirk. Why Hitler halted his troops? A number of theories have been suggested, and we'll talk about them sort of as we go through. Repeatedly requested that they be allowed to move into Dunkirk with their tanks and their infantry. Hitler steadfastly refused until the 26th of May, when the German army reported that there was all sorts of heavy shipping activity in the channel. They concluded that the British were going to try to evacuate their troops. With this information in hand, Hitler grudgingly authorized an advance on Dunkirk from the west. On that same day, Göring assured him that his Luftwaffe had destroyed the Dunkirk harbor. While they had dropped some bombs in the harbor, they certainly had not destroyed it because it was used extensively during the evacuation. According to General Hadler, chief of the German General Staff, another possible reason why Hitler gave this stop order was that he was not willing to take a chance on sacrificing another of his armored formations uselessly. He felt that they would be essential in the second stage of his campaign. Other German officers told much the same story and even suggested that Hitler's order was somewhat inspired by political reasons. That is, to improve his chances of peace with England after France was beaten. He believed that the British were more likely to stop fighting if they could escape Dunkirk with their dignity intact. With all this going for them, why then didn't the superior German force take advantage of this situation and press on with what appeared to be a major victory for them? The simple reason is that they were halted in their tracks and even moved back, is that they were given this order by Hitler himself. Historians have continued to argue for years over the mystery of exactly why the Fuhrer let the British escape, when the destruction of a major part of their army would have led to an easy victory over the British with incalculable consequences. Whatever his reason was, that part of the Allied army he wanted most and needed to destroy was, temporarily at least, safe for the time being. During the early part of 1940, the Expeditionary Force's right flank, on 19 May, the French forces allowed a dangerously large gap to occur between them and the VEF. General John Gort, the VEF commander, considered the French army to be, quote, in complete disarray, quote. So on the 22nd of May, after a critical 4-day period, when there was very little contact with the French and almost no guidance from them, General Gort began exploring the possibility of an evacuation to Dunkirk. Churchill was briefed on this situation, but in his view, a retreat was going to be a disastrous invitation to the possible annihilation of the British Expeditionary Force. As events unfolded, there was little Churchill or anyone else could do about the collapse of the French front. As the French army began to melt away, it left the VEF increasingly exposed with very few options open to them except evacuation. To many, the term evacuation smacks of defeatism, but no matter what its term, the VEF was now in a race against time to salvage what they could of the VEF. On 28 May, Churchill warned Parliament of the situation and told them that, quote, that they should prepare themselves for heavy and hard tidings, quote. There were those on both sides of the aisle in Parliament who believed that Britain ought to open negotiations with Hitler before more blood was spilled. At this gathering, Churchill took a brave and irreversible stand, calmly and forcefully and persuasively, as it turns out, with some of the most brilliant oratory of his political life. The point that he made was that neither surrender nor negotiations was a viable option. At that point, the decision to evacuate Dunkirk was made. Using their decoded information from their ultra equipment, determined that the Germans were predicting the fall of France by mid-May 1940. It seemed certain that the entire British army in northern France would be forced to capitulate. Dunkirk was the only port left open to them, but it was just a little harbor which small vessels used at high water. As far as Arras, some of them being more or less cut off by interposing streams of German motorized forces. The Germans had local air superiority and were using it to its full extent in an effort to annihilate the Brits and the French. Then followed a week, the story of which will live forever in the annals at least of British history, a strange week in which things that were unbelievable happened. Along the whole, somehow, although the whole weight of the German army with their tanks, artillery, bombers, and whatnot, were savagely attacking the narrow corridor of land leading to the Dunkirk beaches, which were held by the retreating British and French forces. As soon as Prime Minister Churchill became aware of exactly what was happening, he appointed Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay of the Royal Navy to begin making plans for the evacuation of the troops from Dunkirk. His first broadcast to the nation as Prime Minister in what he called, quote, a solemn hour for the life of our country and of the empire and for the cause of freedom. He did not attempt to sugarcoat what he called, quote, the gravity of the hour, quote, in France, bluntly noting that the fighting could eventually spread to Britain itself. To lift public morale, he pledged that no matter what happened, Britain would endure. Operation Dynamo, and that's what your little brochure is basically about, the handout. This operation was codenamed, was begun immediately. Admiral Ramsay and his staff made the necessary arrangements for every available destroyer in the Royal Navy to be prepared for rescue duty. In addition, he began mobilizing any and everything that would float to assist in the rescue effort. Word traveled swiftly around all the coasts and creeks of southeastern England, and a vast flotilla of little ships, yachts, fishing boats, Thames barges, pleasure boats, old lifeboats, dinghies, anything that would float was put across the channel to help bring home the men of England. Douglas Bader, you'll recognize the name, the RAF Spitfire fighter ace, who later became the air marshal in charge of the bomber command, was flying cover over this operation, and he described the scene this way, quote, the sea from Dunkirk to Dover during these days of the evacuation looked like any coastal road in England on a bank holiday. It was solid with shipping. One felt one could walk across without getting one's feet wet, or at least that's what it looked like from the air. While hundreds of troops were rescued directly from the beaches, the majority boarded large ships from inside the port at Dunkirk. Churchill made it known when he was talking to Parliament that he hoped to get at least 45,000 troops home from Dunkirk. In fact, the final count was nearly 338,000, which included about 110,000 French and Belgium troops. The captain quoted that it was the queerest, most nondescript flotilla he had ever seen, and it was manned by every kind of Englishman. Never more than 2 men, often only one, to each small boat. There were bankers, dentists, taxi drivers, yachtsmen, longshoremen, engineers, fishermen, and civil servants. He said it was dark before we could clear the English harbor. It wasn't very rough, even though it was fairly choppy. He said it was sufficient to make it very wet for us, and we were all soaked to the skin. Soon in the dark, the big boats began to overtake us. We were in a sort of dark traffic lane with unaccountable waves from the wash of the larger vessels. When destroyers went by, full tilt, the wash was a serious matter to us little fellows. We could only spin the wheel and try to head into the waves, hang on, and hope for the best.